Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where captivating stories and mysteries come to life. Make sure to subscribe and join us on this exciting journey of suspense and intrigue. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your feedback means a lot to us. Miss Marple and Where the Bees Bear Witness. Chapter 1. A Welcome Return. Miss Marple sat quietly at her favorite spot near the sitting room window, her attention fixed on the delicate pattern of lace she was carefully mending. From here she had an ideal vantage point. The gentle comings and goings of village life unfolded subtly beneath her watchful gaze. Birds flitted about the hedgerows, and the occasional bicycle trundled past on the road that curved gently through St. Mary Mead. The calm of the morning was disrupted by footsteps, rapid and purposeful, on the gravel path leading to her cottage door. Moments later, the familiar knock announced Clara, breathless as usual with news or gossip from the village. "Good morning, Clara," said Miss Marple, placing her needlework aside. "You seem rather animated this morning. Is there something important happening?" Clara stepped into the room, her face flushed with excitement. She removed her hat, brushing away strands of hair blown loose by the brisk wind outside. "Oh, Miss Marple, I couldn't wait to tell you. You remember Dr. George, don't you, the one living down on the left-hand side of St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes twinkling slightly as she recalled the doctor's amiable nature. "Yes, indeed, Dr. George. If I recall correctly, he is also the parish priest at the church." "Exactly," Clara replied, seating herself opposite Miss Marple and arranging her skirt neatly. "Well, it seems he's officially given up practicing medicine. He's decided to dedicate himself fully to the church now." Miss Marple smiled gently. She had always admired Dr. George's commitment to the people of St. Mary Mead, whether he was healing their bodies or soothing their souls. His cottage, small and quaint, sat neatly adjacent to the old churchyard, perfectly suited for a man of contemplation and service. "I imagine it was difficult for him to leave medicine," Miss Marple mused, "but perhaps the village is better off with him caring exclusively for their spiritual well-being." Clara nodded emphatically, clearly delighted that her news had met with such immediate approval. "Indeed, it's true. But that isn't the only bit of news, Miss Marple. The maid, Sally, you remember her? She overheard that Dr. George's younger sister, Annie, is returning home." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Annie?" "Yes, of course. Dear Annie, she must have left, 5 years ago now? I remember how excited she was going all the way to Australia for her studies. Such an adventurous spirit she had." "That's right," Clara confirmed, "and now she's finally completed her studies and is coming back to St. Mary Mead. Sally says she's expected to arrive this Saturday evening." Miss Marple took a moment, casting her memory back to Annie as she was 5 years earlier. A bright-eyed girl, full of laughter and optimism, always smiling and helpful. Annie had frequently visited Miss Marple's garden, keenly interested in learning about flowers and herbs, her questions filled with genuine curiosity and warmth. How quickly time had passed. Annie would be a grown woman now, a young lady with her own experiences, no doubt changed by the wider world she had seen. "Such wonderful news," Miss Marple said warmly, her voice gentle with sincere pleasure. She was always such a cheerful girl, one couldn't help but be fond of her. "I expect she's changed a great deal since we last saw her." Clara agreed readily, though her expression suggested she knew little about how the girl had actually changed. "I expect so, Miss Marple. 5 years in Australia, who knows what she might have become." Miss Marple chuckled softly, resuming her stitching as she spoke. "Oh, people rarely change at their core, Clara. Circumstances may differ, of course, but Annie's good nature and bright disposition are likely still intact. Clara hesitated, remembering something important she had almost neglected to mention. She leaned forward, eyes widening slightly. "Oh dear, Miss Marple, here I am talking and nearly forgetting the most exciting part. Dr. George is arranging a special gathering to celebrate Annie's return. It's to be this Saturday evening at the vicarage, and you're especially invited along with other notable residents." Miss Marple's eyes lit with gentle pleasure. It had been some time since the village had had a proper gathering. Small events in St. Mary Mead often carried significant weight and were remembered fondly long afterwards. This celebration for Annie's return promised to be such an occasion, filled with familiar faces, laughter, and perhaps even a touch of gentle gossip. "That sounds delightful, Clara. Naturally, I shall be there. It will be wonderful to welcome Annie home again." Clara rose swiftly, her message successfully delivered, her enthusiasm now satisfied. "I'll let Dr. George know you'll definitely come. He'll be so pleased. Everyone in the village values your presence so much." "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple replied, her voice filled with quiet warmth. "And please give Dr. George my best regards." "I shall indeed," Clara promised, already at the door, and reaching for her hat. "Well, I must hurry along now, there's so much preparation still to do." With Clara's departure, silence once again settled gently upon Miss Marple's cottage, though it was now tinged with the warmth of anticipation. Annie's return had stirred memories, happy ones, but Miss Marple knew enough about life in St. Mary Mead to recognize that new arrivals, especially those returning from distant places, often brought unexpected stories and occasionally unforeseen consequences. She returned to her lacework, hands deftly moving through the delicate fabric, her thoughts turning inward. Annie's arrival was certain to bring both joy and intrigue. St. Mary Mead, after all, was rarely as simple as it appeared at first glance. Behind its picturesque cottages and blooming gardens, there lay secrets, quiet whispers, and the gentle hum of mysteries yet to unfold. And in that quiet moment, Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of curiosity. Yes, Annie's return promised more than just a happy reunion. It might very well be the beginning of something intriguing. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself as she stitched. There was something comforting, after all, in knowing that her peaceful village still held the potential for excitement. Saturday evening could not come quickly enough. Chapter 2. A Gathering Storm. The warm evening air carried the gentle fragrance of roses as Miss Marple approached Dr. George's residence. The vicarage, a spacious Georgian house, stood proudly amid well-tended lawns bordered by neatly trimmed hedges. Lanterns glowed softly, illuminating the garden path, where small groups of villagers had begun to gather, murmuring greetings as they chatted in polite clusters. Miss Marple recognized several familiar faces as she moved slowly through the gate. Joan and Mrs. Joan waved warmly from near the garden bench, the pair inseparable as always, exchanging discreet observations of arriving guests. Nearby stood Ethel, her voice rising above the general hum, energetically describing some minor village scandal to a captive audience. Miss Marple moved discreetly to avoid attracting her attention. Ethel was the type of conversationalist one preferred to evade if a peaceful evening was desired. The hostess of the gathering, Dr. George himself, approached Miss Marple with a welcoming smile. Tall and lean, his demeanor still reflected the discipline of his medical past, softened now by years of gentle parish service. "So glad you could come, Miss Marple." George greeted her warmly. "Annie will be delighted to see you." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I'm looking forward to it greatly, George. How wonderful it must be for you, having her home again, after so many years." George nodded happily, glancing towards the road. "I believe she's due any moment now," Almost as if summoned by his words, a taxi appeared at the gate, its headlights briefly flooding the garden. Curious villagers paused their conversations, watching with interest as the taxi door opened. Annie stepped onto the path, smiling brightly at the familiar scene before her. But Annie was not alone. Emerging from the taxi behind her were two young men and the woman, all unfamiliar to the gathered villagers. A ripple of whispered curiosity swept through the guests. Annie, radiant in a simple blue dress, walked forward quickly, greeting her brother with an affectionate embrace. Turning eagerly, she caught sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple!" Annie exclaimed, her joy evident as she reached forward to clasp the elderly lady's hand warmly. "It's been far too long. You've grown into a remarkable young woman," Miss Marple responded, her eyes twinkling affectionately. "Australia certainly seems to have suited you well." "It did indeed," Annie replied, turning to her friends, "and I couldn't resist bringing some of it back with me. Allow me to introduce everyone." She guided her friends forward, a slight hush descending on the garden as the villagers eagerly awaited introductions. "This is Abigail," Annie announced first, indicating the young woman whose fair complexion and striking dark hair immediately caught everyone's eye. Abigail smiled shyly and nodded politely. "And Oliver," Annie continued, gesturing to a neatly dressed young man whose easy charm quickly endeared him to the gathered villagers. "Abigail and Oliver are classmates of mine and are soon to be married." A murmur of approval rippled through the guests, accompanied by nods and smiles. Such announcements always went down well in St. Mary Mead. And finally, Annie paused slightly, her cheeks flushing with a faint pink. "This is Lucas." Lucas stepped forward confidently. Tall and clearly Australian, with golden brown hair and a relaxed manner, he offered the villagers an engaging smile. Annie continued, her voice soft yet clear. "Lucas and I, well, we are in love." This unexpected announcement caused a momentary silence, swiftly followed by a buzz of intrigued conversation. Villagers exchanged meaningful glances. It was rare that events this interesting occurred in their quiet corner of England. Miss Marple, observing this quiet commotion with her usual calm, exchanged a discreet glance with Dr. George, noting the surprise in his eyes as he digested Annie's revelation. But George recovered quickly, stepping forward and clapping his hands gently to attract attention. "Dinner is served," he announced with cheerful authority, steering the guests smoothly towards tables laden with food at the center of the garden. As evening settled comfortably around them, conversation flowed more easily. Abigail and Oliver spoke of their life in Australia, their wedding plans eagerly absorbed by Ethel, who listened raptly, clearly already planning how she would relay every detail the following morning. Lucas spoke less, though his conversation when engaged was intelligent and lively. Miss Marple noted how his eyes often sought out Annie, a genuine affection evident in his glance. The evening was proving charmingly pleasant. Later, as twilight deepened into darkness punctuated by the soft glow of lanterns, Miss Marple noted Abigail slipping quietly from her seat, unnoticed by most. Something in the young woman's expression, her swift, purposeful stride, caught Miss Marple's attention. Shortly thereafter, Lucas also rose discreetly, following Abigail's path around the side of the house. Miss Marple, attuned to subtle irregularities, raised an eyebrow slightly, considering the implications of this discreet departure. Perhaps nothing sinister, but her instincts, honed by decades of careful observation, were rarely wrong. Conversation continued easily until, as the evening began winding down, a sharp scream shattered the calm. Every head turned instantly, startled and alert. Abigail emerged from the darkness behind the house, staggering towards the gathered guests. She appeared frantic, her arms flailing as she fought against unseen tormentors. "Help me!" she cried desperately, stumbling forward into the faint circle of lamplight, her pale skin now blotched red and angry. "Bees, they're attacking! Lucas, please help him!" The guests rose hastily, confusion and alarm spreading through them. Before anyone could fully grasp what was happening, Abigail collapsed onto the grass, her voice fading into painful whispers. "Lucas, behind the house, hurry!" Dr. George hurried to Abigail's side, swiftly assessing her condition as other guests hastened to the rear of the house. Miss Marple moved with surprising agility, keeping pace with Annie, whose face had drained of color. Reaching the back of the house, the villagers found Lucas lying unconscious on the ground, his body covered with numerous bee stings. The insects still swarmed angrily nearby, buzzing aggressively. Several villagers drew back in fright. "Quickly, we must get him away from here," Marple instructed urgently. "Call an ambulance immediately." Oliver rushed indoors, dialing for help as the villagers cautiously carried Lucas away from danger. Annie knelt beside Lucas, tears streaming down her cheeks, fear evident in her trembling hands as she clasped his limp hand tightly. Miss Marple stood nearby, quietly observing the chaotic scene. Her sharp eyes carefully took in the unusual details: the disturbed beehives nestled beneath a willow, overturned garden chairs, and Abigail's behavior, now drifting between consciousness and delirium. Paramedics arrived swiftly, moving Lucas and Abigail carefully into the waiting ambulance. Villagers watched in stunned silence as the vehicle sped away, lights flashing ominously. An uneasy hush settled over the garden. The joyous reunion had turned into an unexpected tragedy. Villagers whispered anxiously among themselves, searching for answers and explanations. Dr. George, pale and shaken, spoke quietly with Annie, attempting reassurance though clearly uncertain himself. Miss Marple stood slightly apart, her sharp eyes thoughtful and alert. Something about tonight's events troubled her deeply. The bee attack had been sudden and violent, but something felt disturbingly unnatural about it. Too abrupt, too specific. As guests slowly dispersed into the night, murmuring their sympathies and anxieties, Miss Marple remained in the shadows, quietly piecing together the evening's unsettling puzzle. St. Mary Mead, it seemed, had once again become a place where peace and danger walked closely, side by side. This was no mere accident, Miss Marple suspected. Something darker lurked beneath this strange attack, something yet to reveal itself. Chapter 3. Shadows and Stones. The blue lights of the ambulance cast an eerie glow over the garden, flickering across faces filled with confusion and dread. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their earlier joy now transformed into uncertainty and shock. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter and pleasant conversation, was now heavy with questions. Dr. Franklin, the government doctor, emerged from the ambulance, his expression solemn. He moved towards Lucas, who lay lifeless beneath a hastily arranged blanket, his face still bearing the evidence of the bee attack. A tense silence hung in the air as Franklin conducted his examination, carefully checking Lucas's pulse and breathing. Miss Marple watched from a distance, her eyes carefully observing the subtle changes in the doctor's expression. Finally, Dr. Franklin straightened and shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do," he declared quietly but firmly. "Lucas is dead." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered villagers. Annie, who had been standing close by, let out a strangled cry, collapsing against her brother George. Dr. George embraced her, his face pale with shock, trying to soothe her, even as his own hands trembled. Someone from among the shocked guests hastily telephoned the police. Within minutes, a police car pulled up, its headlights slicing through the gloom. Inspector Harding emerged, his stern presence immediately commanding attention. Accompanied by several constables, he strode purposefully towards the scene, carefully observing the faces of villagers who stood huddled anxiously together. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Inspector Harding greeted her quietly as he approached. His usually composed face was visibly strained. "This is an unfortunate situation indeed. An Australian visitor dying on our patch. There's bound to be pressure from higher authorities. We'll need to investigate thoroughly to ascertain whether this was merely an accident or deliberate." Miss Marple nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, Inspector. First and foremost, we must carefully examine the area where the incident occurred. Inspector Harding turned swiftly to his constable, instructing in a firm voice. Constable Harris, take the names and addresses of everyone present, and keep everyone together in the front garden. Make sure no one leaves. Meanwhile, Miss Marple and I will inspect the scene. With a determined nod, Constable Harris began gathering the villagers, gently ushering them away from the distressing sight. Inspector Harding and Miss Marple proceeded to the rear of the house, their footsteps quiet on the damp grass. They soon arrived beneath a large willow tree. In its upper branches, Miss Marple immediately spotted a sizable beehive, illuminated softly by torchlight. The bees hummed quietly, undisturbed once more. Their earlier aggression inexplicably vanished. Inspector Harding peered upwards, his expression puzzled. They seem calm enough now, he remarked quietly, carefully stepping closer to the base of the tree. It hardly looks as though these bees could cause such deadly chaos. Miss Marple examined the scene carefully, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. Honey bees rarely attack unless provoked, Inspector, she said softly, gazing thoughtfully upwards. I strongly suspect that someone deliberately disturbed this hive. It's possible Lucas's death was not accidental. Inspector Harding frowned deeply, considering her words. But Abigail was also attacked. She might have been the intended target. Miss Marple nodded, slowly thoughtful. Exactly, Inspector. Perhaps Abigail was targeted, or perhaps both were intended victims. Either way, there is something very deliberate about what happened here. She moved slowly around the tree, torchlight illuminating the ground beneath. Suddenly Miss Marple halted, her eyes focusing intently downward. Stooping slightly, she picked up something from the ground. What is it? Asked Harding, approaching cautiously. Stones, Miss Marple said simply, holding out her palm to reveal several small, rounded pebbles. These were lying scattered just beneath the hive. They're clearly out of place. Someone threw these intentionally, I'd wager. Inspector Harding took a closer look, his brow knitted with concern. You think someone deliberately threw stones at the hive to agitate the bees? Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed firmly. This wasn't random or accidental. Whoever threw these stones knew exactly what would happen. The inspector moved slowly around the area, his torch beam searching for further clues. This changes everything, Miss Marple. If someone deliberately set the bees upon Lucas and Abigail, we are now dealing with murder. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, her expression deeply contemplative. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the evening's tragic puzzle. I fear you're right, Inspector, she finally murmured. The question now becomes who and why. They stood together quietly, each absorbed in thought, the soft hum of the bees now strangely menacing in the quiet night air. Inspector Harding took a deep breath, turning once more to Miss Marple, clearly disturbed. Let's return to the guests, he said finally, straightening. We'll need their accounts of exactly where everyone was at the time of the attack. Returning to the front garden, they found the guests seated quietly, each face reflecting confusion and grief. Constable Harris had completed his notes and handed them dutifully to the inspector, who briefly glanced through the names before addressing the gathering. I'm sorry for this distressing situation, Inspector Harding began solemnly, his voice calm and authoritative. But this incident has become a serious matter. A young man has lost his life, and evidence suggests it was deliberate. I must now ask each of you precisely where you were and what you saw at the time. A hushed murmur ran through the villagers. Ethel, looking shaken, was first to speak. Inspector, we were all seated here. Most of us didn't even realize Abigail and Lucas had left until we heard her scream. Chapter 4. Secrets Revealed. In the muted glow of George's drawing room, Inspector Harding and Miss Marple sat opposite Dr. George, who appeared visibly shaken by the night's tragic events. Outside, the villagers lingered uncertainly, whispering anxiously among themselves, waiting for the outcome of the investigation. George's normally welcoming home had become a somber place, filled with shadows and doubts. Inspector Harding, notebook in hand, cleared his throat carefully. "Dr. George," he began formally, his tone gentle yet firm. "Did you know there was a honeybee hive at the back of your property?" George looked up, startled for a brief moment before nodding steadily. "Yes, Inspector, I knew about it very well. In fact, I maintain it myself. Honey is a pleasant addition to the household, something I've enjoyed tending to personally." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, eyes kind but probing. "Dr. George, if you've been caring for these bees for some time, have they ever been aggressive towards you?" George hesitated briefly, his gaze shifting to the floor as though revisiting an unpleasant memory. After a short pause, he replied, "Yes, Miss Marple. Once, while tending the hive, a bee stung me quite severely. I experienced a significant allergic reaction. It took a full week to recover, and I had to take a considerable amount of medication. It was a rather distressing episode." Inspector Harding jotted notes silently, glancing briefly at Miss Marple, before continuing carefully. "Considering your reaction, did you not think keeping bees was rather dangerous?" George shook his head slowly. "It only happened once. Usually the bees are quite calm, so I took precautions and continued. Nothing similar occurred since then." Miss Marple paused thoughtfully, then steered the conversation towards a more personal subject. "George, were you previously aware of Annie's relationship with Lucas?" George's eyes widened, clearly taken aback. He shook his head vehemently. "Absolutely not. Annie told me nothing about Lucas or any romantic relationship she might have developed abroad. It was a complete surprise to me." Miss Marple regarded him gently but attentively. "And the presence of her other friends, Abigail and Oliver, did you expect their arrival tonight?" George sighed deeply, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration coloring his expression. "No, I didn't expect Annie to bring anyone with her. She never mentioned guests. I had assumed Annie would be coming home alone, and intended tonight's gathering to serve another purpose entirely." The inspector raised an eyebrow in interest. "Could you clarify that, Dr. George?" "What other purpose?" George shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks slightly reddened. "You see, Inspector, I had planned this party specifically to introduce Annie to my cousin Thomas, who is also present tonight. I had hoped they might become engaged. This was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a moment of celebration to unite two families. Now, of course, everything has gone terribly wrong." Inspector Harding considered this carefully. "So your cousin Thomas was also unaware of Annie's relationship with Lucas?" George nodded. "Absolutely. It must have been a shock for Thomas and his family as well. They've already left, understandably upset. My greatest concern now is how they might perceive this whole matter. It's terribly embarrassing." Miss Marple studied George with quiet contemplation, noting his agitation carefully before speaking again. "George, you briefly left the party at one point this evening, entering the house before returning shortly thereafter. Might I inquire why?" George appeared momentarily puzzled, then recognition dawned on his face. "Ah, yes, I did leave for a moment. It was nothing suspicious, Miss Marple, I assure you. I had spilled wine onto my coat sleeve. Quite a noticeable stain, you understand. I simply stepped inside to clean it off quickly." Inspector Harding exchanged a brief glance with Miss Marple. He then probed gently. "How long were you inside?" George considered this carefully. "Only a few minutes. Perhaps 5, no more. I just dabbed the stain with some soda water in the kitchen. My maid Sally can attest to seeing me." Miss Marple nodded gently, filing this detail away carefully. "Dr. George, did you happen to notice anyone else inside the house during your brief absence from the party?" George hesitated, frowning slightly as he tried to recall clearly. "No, I don't think so. I was in the kitchen briefly and then returned directly outside. Everything seemed perfectly normal to me." Inspector Harding appeared thoughtful. "Dr. George, forgive the bluntness of my question, but was there any resentment or anger when you discovered Annie's attachment to Lucas? Perhaps a motive for jealousy?" George looked genuinely shocked by the suggestion, shaking his head adamantly. "No, Inspector. Of course, I was disappointed, but never angry. Annie is my sister. Her happiness is important to me. If Lucas was her choice, I would eventually accept it, though I would naturally have preferred prior warning. Inspector Harding observed George closely, noting his sincerity. Thank you for your frankness, Dr. George. We must now speak to your maid and other guests. Please remain available if we need further clarification. George nodded, clearly relieved the interrogation had ended, yet still visibly shaken. Inspector Harding and Miss Marple stepped outside into the cool night air, exchanging a thoughtful glance as they moved away from the house. George seems sincere, Harding murmured quietly, but his disappointment is obvious. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes sharp and reflective. Indeed, Inspector. The motive of disappointed expectations can be strong, but whether it's strong enough for murder remains to be seen. Harding sighed. We'll need to confirm his whereabouts during those crucial minutes, as talk to Sally next. Miss Marple glanced back briefly at the brightly lit drawing room window, where George now sat quietly, head bowed in anxious thought. Yes, Inspector, and perhaps it's wise to consider the implications of Annie's unexpected guests. Their sudden appearance tonight, though seemingly innocent, has disrupted more plans than just George's. Harding frowned deeply. You suspect something more complicated? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled knowingly in the soft moonlight. Inspector, it is my experience that simple plans rarely remain uncomplicated. Annie's Australian friends arrived unexpectedly, bringing relationships and tensions perhaps unknown even to Annie herself. We must understand these dynamics carefully before concluding anything. Harding nodded solemnly, absorbing her words thoughtfully. We shall proceed cautiously, Miss Marple. Your insight is, as always, greatly valued. Together they walked back towards the gathered villagers, their minds now heavy with new questions. Miss Marple knew well the secrets villagers kept, sometimes even from themselves. Tonight had uncovered hidden tensions, secret disappointments, and disrupted plans. The quiet facade of St. Mary Mead, she reflected, had cracked once more, revealing complexities yet to be fully understood. And somewhere within these tangled relationships, hidden beneath disappointment and pride, Miss Marple felt certain they would uncover the truth behind Lucas's death. Chapter 5. Hidden Feelings. Abigail lay on the sofa in Dr. George's drawing room, her face pale and eyes red from crying. A soft lamp illuminated her features, casting long shadows across the room. Miss Marple and Inspector Harding stood quietly nearby, both aware of the delicate nature of the situation. Miss Marple approached Abigail gently, placing a comforting hand lightly upon her shoulder. I understand you're exhausted, Abigail, she said softly, but I'm afraid we must ask you a few important questions. It's essential we understand exactly what happened tonight. Abigail opened her eyes slowly, confusion mingling with fear. Is Lucas dead? She asked anxiously, her voice trembling. Inspector Harding nodded solemnly. Yes, Abigail. I'm afraid Lucas has died. Hearing these words, Abigail's composure dissolved entirely, and she burst into anguished tears. Her sobs filled the quiet room, raw grief shaking her shoulders. Miss Marple remained beside her, patient and kind, giving her time to collect herself. When Abigail's crying finally subsided, Miss Marple gently resumed questioning. I'm so sorry for your loss, Abigail, but it's vital that we understand what led up to this tragedy. Could you please tell me why you went to the back of the house this evening? Abigail hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, she began quietly, her voice strained. When Annie announced at the party that she and Lucas were in love, I felt deeply hurt and terribly angry. I just couldn't bear being around everyone any longer. I needed to be alone, so I walked to the back of the house. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully, her voice soft and understanding. Why did Annie's announcement upset you so much, Abigail? After all, weren't you already engaged to Oliver? Abigail shook her head bitterly, her expression clouded with resentment. My engagement to Oliver was never my own choice. Our families arranged it without even asking me. Oliver is a good man, but I never truly loved him." She hesitated, her voice dropping even lower. "It was Lucas, whom I cared deeply about. I had always hoped that, one day, he would see me as something more than just a friend." Inspector Harding listened closely, making notes as Abigail spoke. He then stepped forward carefully, gently pressing the question further. "When Lucas followed you behind the house, Abigail, what exactly did you discuss?" Abigail lowered her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was angry, hurt. I told Lucas plainly that he couldn't marry Annie, that it wasn't right, because I loved him. I begged him to reconsider, but Lucas wouldn't listen. He told me firmly that he loved Annie deeply and intended to marry her. He didn't want to hurt me, but his mind was completely made up." She paused, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she struggled to continue. "It was during this painful conversation that the bees suddenly attacked us. They came from nowhere, swarming violently. We tried to run, but Lucas stumbled and fell. Before I could even try to help him, the bees were everywhere, stinging us both. I ran, screaming for help. I never intended any harm to Lucas, I swear." Miss Marple studied Abigail quietly, her sharp eyes noticing the genuine grief in the girl's face. The pain she showed was undoubtedly sincere, but Miss Marple knew better than most how complicated human emotions could be, especially those intertwined with love and jealousy. The inspector nodded gently, carefully absorbing Abigail's account. "Thank you, Abigail. You've been very brave in telling us all this. Rest assured, we'll do our best to uncover the truth." At that very moment, a young constable appeared at the doorway, his expression serious. "Sir," he reported respectfully to Inspector Harding, "I've completed the list of all guests attending tonight's party. Some of the guests are residents of St. Mary Mead, but others have traveled from the city." Inspector Harding nodded, ticking the paper and scanning through it briefly. "Very good, Constable. Please ensure none of the guests leave until we have completed our inquiries." The constable saluted briskly before turning back towards the garden, where the anxious guests still waited. Miss Marple watched the inspector quietly. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "it might be helpful to consider that Lucas and Abigail's confrontation behind the house was not a secret. Someone could easily have overheard, or even anticipated, their conversation." Inspector Harding frowned deeply, troubled. "Yes, Miss Marple, that's certainly possible. If someone deliberately disturbed the bees at that precise moment, they must have known the situation between Abigail, Lucas, and Annie intimately." Miss Marple nodded sagely. "Exactly, Inspector. The bees were merely the instrument. The real motive lies in the tangled emotions within this group. Jealousy can inspire reckless actions, especially when hearts are broken and relationships complicated." Inspector Harding glanced back at Abigail, who now lay exhausted, eyes closed and breathing unevenly. He lowered his voice discreetly. "Do you believe Abigail's account?" Miss Marple considered this carefully, her gaze steady. "Yes, I do believe her. She appears genuinely heartbroken, but that does not eliminate the possibility that her actions unintentionally triggered Lucas's death." Harding sighed heavily, clearly troubled. "Then our task grows even more complex. We must now understand exactly who knew about Abigail's feelings and who stood to benefit from Lucas's death." Miss Marple smiled gently, eyes twinkling faintly despite the gravity of the situation. "Precisely, Inspector. We must closely examine every detail, every subtle reaction and overheard remark. I suspect the answer lies among the guests, who tonight have revealed their own hidden resentments and secret ambitions." Inspector Harding nodded decisively. "Then let's return to the others. There are still guests whose statements we must take, particularly Oliver and Annie. Their perspectives may yet reveal crucial insights." Together they left Abigail resting quietly, stepping outside into the cool night air. The garden was still filled with the low murmur of anxious conversation, villagers and visitors alike awaiting answers and reassurance. Miss Marple gazed around thoughtfully, noting the worried faces illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns. In her mind, she carefully considered the complexity of the relationships at play: Annie's unsuspecting declaration, Abigail's unspoken love, Oliver's engagement, and now Lucas's tragic death. A tangled web indeed, thought Miss Marple as she and Inspector Harding moved decisively towards the remaining guests. In such tangled webs, Miss Marple knew, the truth could never remain hidden for long. For beneath the calm exterior of St. Mary Mead, as always, simmered secrets. Secrets waiting quietly and patiently for Miss Marple's gentle, yet inexorable probing. Chapter 6. A Disturbing Discovery. Early the next morning, Inspector Harding stood quietly at the vicarage gate, reading the freshly delivered post-mortem report. The results were clear. Lucas had died from multiple bee stings, causing an acute allergic reaction and ultimately cardiac arrest. Already the newspapers had splashed sensational headlines across their front pages declaring, "Australian youth dies in St. Mary Mead after bee attack." Miss Marple joined the inspector outside, noticing the troubled look on his face. "Is the report in?" she asked gently. The inspector nodded solemnly. "It confirms exactly what we suspected, Miss Marple. Death by multiple bee stings, but we still don't have conclusive evidence that it was intentional." Miss Marple considered this thoughtfully. "Inspector, perhaps we need to shift our focus. So far we've examined the scene outside carefully, but perhaps the answer lies within. Why don't we thoroughly search the inside of the house? It might reveal something important." Inspector Harding immediately agreed. "You may be right. Let's go inside." Together they entered Dr. George's large, comfortable home. Its interior was quiet and somewhat gloomy now, a stark contrast to the warmth and laughter that had filled it just the night before. Moving silently upstairs, they approached George's bedroom. Inspector Harding opened the door quietly, and they stepped inside, instantly enveloped in the calm atmosphere of a neatly kept, old-fashioned room. Miss Marple immediately moved toward the window, carefully pulling back the curtains. From this position, she had a clear view of the garden and, more importantly, the tree where the deadly hive hung silently. The hive was clearly visible, its outline stark against the clear morning sky. Anyone standing here could have easily observed Abigail and Lucas, then deliberately targeted the hive. "Inspector," Miss Marple remarked quietly, "this vantage point offers a perfect view of the garden, including the tree with the beehive. Whoever stood here could clearly see their targets." Inspector Harding moved closer, confirming her observation. "Indeed, Miss Marple." And George did admit he left the party momentarily to come into the house. He claimed it was merely to clean wine from his coat, but perhaps there was another reason. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her sharp eyes scanning the room methodically. She carefully opened drawers, inspecting each with meticulous care, mindful of small, overlooked clues. As she searched George's bedside table drawer, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Drawing it out gently, she held it carefully to the light. It was a small slingshot, a simple child's toy but strong enough to launch stones with precision. Miss Marple's face became grave. She examined the slingshot closely, noticing faint residue of dirt and tiny grains of gravel still clinging to the leather strap. Inspector Harding observed her discovery with keen interest, leaning forward eagerly. "What have you found, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple held up the slingshot, her voice serious yet composed. "Inspector, look carefully. I believe we've found our answer. This slingshot could easily have been used to throw small stones at the beehive from this very window." Inspector Harding studied the slingshot carefully, realizing immediately the implications. "You're suggesting, George, use this slingshot to deliberately provoke the bees into attacking Lucas and Abigail?" Miss Marple's expression remained grave. "Precisely, Inspector. Remember, George himself admitted that he was severely allergic to bee stings and had suffered greatly in the past. He certainly understood the danger of provoking bees. Moreover, George had a clear motive. He was deeply disappointed when Annie introduced Lucas as her intended partner. He had different plans for Annie, plans involving his cousin Thomas. Inspector Harding frowned deeply. But why risk killing Abigail as well? Miss Marple shook her head gently. I suspect Abigail was merely collateral damage in this tragedy. Perhaps George saw Lucas and Abigail together and assumed both posed an obstacle to his intentions. Or perhaps he simply didn't care who else was harmed, as long as Lucas was removed. Inspector Harding took a deep breath, pacing the room slowly as he processed this theory. George's actions seem extreme for such disappointment, but I've seen jealousy and anger drive respectable people to desperate measures, yet why use such a risky method, something he couldn't fully control? Miss Marple offered a quiet, reflective response. Precisely because it was risky, Inspector, B's attacking could easily be seen as a tragic accident. It provided the perfect cover for his actions. No one would suspect deliberate murder, especially since George himself kept bees. He might have assumed suspicion would never fall on him. Inspector Harding nodded slowly. A clever plan indeed, but clearly George underestimated your observational powers, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly with sad wisdom. People often underestimate the small details, Inspector. A simple child's slingshot might be overlooked by many, but even the smallest object can reveal great truths. Inspector Harding straightened resolutely, turning towards the door. We must speak with George immediately. His explanation must be thorough. I'll take this slingshot as evidence. Together they left the bedroom, the house now feeling colder and emptier than ever. As they walked back downstairs, Miss Marple felt deeply saddened. It was always painful to reveal hidden darkness in those she knew and trusted. George, once respected and admired, had become ensnared by jealousy and disappointment, leading him down a dangerous and tragic path. Chapter 7. Shadows Among the Roses. It was near dusk in the sprawling garden of the old manor house, and the once vibrant flowers seemed to droop in the fading light. Lanterns glowed softly along the winding stone paths, illuminating a small gathering of guests whose expressions ranged from shock to sorrow. At the center of this tense assembly stood a handful of people caught in the gravity of a tragic discovery. Annie, her eyes swollen and tear-streaked, sat hunched on a low wooden bench. Her trembling shoulders shook as she attempted to contain her sobs. Oliver, visibly anguished, knelt beside her, one arm protectively draped around her trembling form. Abigail, normally poised and outspoken, had retreated into a stunned silence. She sat on an old wicker chair a short distance away, ankles crossed, and her hands clenched in her lap. Though her gaze was lowered, anyone who looked closely would see the faint quiver of her lips. George, tall and wiry, paced anxiously to one side, arms folded over his chest as if bracing against some unseen chill. He had not spoken for several minutes, but his restless movements and darting eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. A group of other guests, friends, relatives, and acquaintances of the family stood off to the side, equally shocked. Some whispered theories to one another, while others simply stared at the ground, feet shuffling. The evening breeze carried the sense of damp earth and fresh foliage, but it offered no comfort. The entire household was waiting, as though time itself had stalled in the wake of tragedy. Miss Marple, a figure of gentle authority and razor-sharp perception, raised her head. Her kind eyes missed nothing, and her steady voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "George," she said softly yet clearly enough for all to hear. "That slingshot is yours, isn't it? Why did you kill Lucas?" A ripple of shock coursed through the gathering. Miss Marple's directness, usually cloaked in gentle inquiries, signaled just how grave the circumstances had become. She held a small, childlike slingshot in her hand, the wooden frame worn smooth from use. The faded initials GB were etched along one side, confirming it as George's. George stopped pacing. His normally confident bearing seemed to crumble under her penetrating stare. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, grasping in vain for composure. All eyes were on him. The seconds stretched before he finally spoke. "Yes," he admitted in a trembling voice. It's mine, but I never meant. Lucas. He broke off, swallowing hard as though trying to steady himself. Then with a deep breath, he continued, voice low. When Annie announced she wanted to marry Lucas, I was already working on an arrangement. My cousin was set to marry her, an arrangement that could have benefited everyone. He promised me funding for the clinic I've been dreaming of building, but only if Annie became part of the family. At this, Annie lifted her head. Her tear-stained face hardened, and fresh tears welled up. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Through trembling lips, she asked, So you tried to stop me from marrying Lucas, by any means necessary? Even murder? No, George insisted, a flare of desperation in his eyes. It wasn't meant to go that far. I only wanted to scare Lucas off so he'd leave you alone. If he disappeared from your life, my cousin would still fund my clinic. I never wanted. His voice faltered again, and he looked away from Annie's devastated face. Oliver, who had been comforting Annie, now straightened and fixed George with a reproachful glare. You took it upon yourself to decide Annie's future, he said, his voice barely controlled. And then you blame your ambition for the clinic as if it were an excuse. George gave Oliver a pleading glance. You don't understand. No one understands how important that clinic was to me. My father died because there wasn't adequate medical care in our district. I've spent years saving up money and making connections, but nothing ever worked out. Then my cousin offered a solution, but only if Annie agreed to the marriage. Abigail, who had remained silent, now cleared her throat. Her voice, though soft, cut through the tense hush. Why did you involve me? She asked, her gaze never fully meeting George's. I went to the back of the house, just needing to escape the crowd for a moment, but Lucas followed me. You say you overheard us arguing? George nodded, his eyes flicking anxiously between Miss Marple, Abigail, and Annie. Yes, he replied. I'd gone around the side of the house near the old oak tree to think about what to do next. That's when I heard you talking to Lucas. You were begging him to leave Annie alone, to let her go for her own happiness. But Lucas refused. He said he loved Annie, that nothing would stand in his way. I realized he would never back off. My plan to just scare him, make him think someone was watching, suddenly seemed inadequate. With each word, the weight of George's confession pressed down upon the gathering. The sound of distant thunder rumbled through the cloudy sky, punctuating the still air. Annie buried her face in her hands, tears of anger and sorrow mingling. Abigail's throat felt tight, for she recalled the intensity of Lucas's resolve. He had been insistent, reckless even, yet she had never wished him harm. Then what happened? Miss Marple asked gently, nodding to prompt George on. George's voice wavered again. I only intended to shoot near him, he insisted. To scare him off, make him think there might be some accident if he kept pressing Annie. So I pulled out my slingshot. It was something I kept in my coat pocket. I'd been practicing with it on flies and wasps around the garden. I aimed, but my hand was shaking. The stone flew wide, and before I knew it, Lucas cried out and collapsed. I realized I'd hit him in the temple, or somewhere near there. The next few moments are a blur. He was on the ground, bleeding. I panicked. I never wanted Abigail harmed either. She just happened to be there. A horrified hush descended. The other guests looked on, some with hands pressed to their mouths in shock. Annie clung to Oliver, sobs still echoing across the quiet garden. Miss Marple, her expression grave, regarded George with a mix of sorrow and condemnation. You must understand, George continued, voice barely above a whisper. I never planned murder. This was all because I feared losing my chance to build that clinic. I lost sight of what really mattered, Annie's happiness. I realize that now. His voice broke, and he rubbed his eyes as though trying to erase the scene from his memory. From the edge of the crowd, the police inspector stepped forward. He had been waiting for some sense of clarity, though clearly the confession made his duty no easier. George Barnaby, he announced in an authoritative tone. "I'm afraid I have to place you under arrest for the murder of Lucas Wilcox." As soon as those words were spoken, a rush of emotions rippled through the onlookers. Annie moaned softly, tears coursing down her cheeks. Oliver pressed a supportive hand to her shoulder, though his own face looked ashen. Abigail clasped her hands together and bowed her head, as though offering a silent prayer for the souls involved. George stared at the inspector, tears brimming in his eyes. "Please, understand," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of regret. "It was an accident, but I'll face whatever consequences I must." The inspector stepped forward and gently took George by the arm. As he led him away from the assembled guests, the hush deepened, punctuated only by the mournful cry of a night bird. The garden, once brimming with the promise of celebration and happiness, now felt heavy with loss, overshadowed by the cruelty of fate and ambition. Miss Marple watched them go, her heart constricting. Though George's confession brought resolution to the question of Lucas's death, it offered scant comfort to those left in its wake. Annie, her grief raw and exposed, would carry these scars. Oliver might find solace in caring for her, yet the brightness of the evening had been forever tainted. Abigail, too, was forever changed, having witnessed the tragic consequences of desperation. One by one, the guests dispersed, murmuring their condolences and heartbreak. A few lingered to console Annie, offering words of comfort that scarcely penetrated her anguished mind. Oliver helped her up from the bench, guiding her gently back into the house. She leaned on him, her tears still flowing. Alone, Miss Marple stood in the garden, surveying the strewn petals and overturned chairs, a grim reflection of the turmoil that had unfolded. In the distance, she could see the silhouettes of the inspector and George disappearing beyond the gate. Even for one as accustomed to untangling the hidden motives of others, this outcome felt particularly sad. The mild fragrance of the garden roses drifted past, a gentle reminder that life would persist, even amid sorrow and regret. Slowly, Miss Marple walked over to the bench where Annie had been crying. She picked up a discarded shawl, likely dropped in the commotion, and shook it out. Her mind teemed with compassion for Annie and the heartbreak she now carried. The night was creeping in, and the manor's lights began to glow against the darkening sky. There would be more to discuss, arrangements to be made, statements to be taken. Yet for now, the truth had been laid bare, and it was enough. Miss Marple took one last glance at the slingshot still nestled in her palm, before gently tucking it into a small cloth bag. This simple contraption intended for harmless mischief had become an instrument of tragedy when wielded by a man consumed by worry and ambition. With a sigh, she slipped the bag into her pocket and headed inside, whispering a quiet prayer for all affected by Lucas's untimely death. Though justice would follow its own course in time, she knew that the real solace for everyone, Annie especially, would have to come from within. For some, that peace might prove elusive, but hope, like the faint lantern glow in the garden, would never be entirely extinguished.